Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. We're gathering here to start our next book in this series on wisdom literature, Song of Songs. Song of Songs is a particularly interesting book because basically nobody knows why it's in our Bible, or how it got there, or what it means, or what it's for, and there's a lot of people who say they understand and have theories and speculations. But let's get into some of the basics. It is written in Hebrew. It's in our Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It is probably best to refer to this as Song of Songs rather than Song of Solomon, like many Bibles do, because the book itself is written in the language of the 3rd century BCE in Israel. But then this very first line in the Bible, verse 1, is a superscription, which means it was likely added on later. In this case, it's an interesting one because this book of the Bible is written in 3rd century Hebrew, but the very first line is written in 10th century Hebrew. In other words, 700 years earlier. So apparently somebody started writing this book, wrote one line, and then got writer's block for 700 years. No. More likely what happened is it's a superscription. So the idea that this book is attributed to being written by Solomon was added on after the book was written, and it was done so using the linguistic structure of older Hebrew. Sort of like if you read a New York Times article that started with an opening line out of Chaucer, which is Middle English, and so it would sound a little off, a little different. It would sound older, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean the rest of the book was written by Chaucer, or even in Middle English. So that's an important distinction in what's going on in here. Also, it's a little awkward because the book itself, if the first line is correct, describes itself as Song of Songs by, which is by Solomon, right? Which means its actual title is Song of Songs, which in Hebrew is a superlative, which means it's the ultimate, the best. So this means it's the best song of all the songs. Now, if Solomon had written it and titled it Song of Songs, be a little bit arrogant. Not that that's inconsistent with Solomon, but kind of problematic. On the other hand, if this is a superscription written later, that means that somebody considered this poem to be so great it was worthy of that title, Song of Songs. Personally, I prefer that interpretation, but everybody has their different opinions. Provenance, as I mentioned, the scholarship puts the language of this in the 3rd century BCE. Scholars then generally date it sometime around that, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century BCE, or 10th century BCE, which, if you're going to ascribe it to Solomon, then you need to put it in the 10th century. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose for this book is really not clear. The entirety of the book is often read during Passover in Jewish practice. For us, our Revised Common Lectionary has us read one passage once every 3 years, and it's always the same passage. So we really don't get much of this book in the cycle of our church years. In Judaism, it is sometimes described as an allegory of the relationship between God and Israel, or as a description of God's love for Israel. In Christianity, it's Christ's love for the church, or an allegory for the relationship between Christ and the church. Sometimes that's seen as a little bit of a stretch, and I think what we're gonna do is we're gonna really dive deep in chapter 1 and analyze the text from a lot of different perspectives and try to see different points of view on how this is interpreted. And then after we get through chapter 1, we'll leave it to where people want to raise questions or delve a little deeper. But in a lot of ways, scholars who are focused on linguistic analysis and historical analysis often push back on the heavy religious interpretation to these, and suggest that it's a stretch to get us there. And you can decide for yourself if it's a stretch. And often that the effort to make this even more religious than it is about covering up a sex-positive book in the Bible, right? We'll find that some of the scholarly interpretations have a lot of emphasis on romantic and erotic love in the language of this poem, which brings me to, I really should make this disclaimer, especially for our online audience, that's going to be part of our topic in discussing this book. So if you're uncomfortable with talk about sex and erotic language, even though we're trying to do this from a more academic point of view, trying to understand the book, that still might lead people to some discomfort, and I want to put that disclaimer out there before we get too far in. That's there, and you may want to turn off this video if that's going to make you uncomfortable. Just like with the purpose for the book, we don't really have a consistent structure. A lot of time books of the Bible are broken down into purposes or selections of stories or collection of parables or something like that. There doesn't seem to be any deliberate structure to Song of Songs. It is almost like a stream of consciousness or a conversation that happens between people. It's not planned out in advance. It doesn't stop scholars from trying to apply a structure to it. That's one part of academics, that we try to force things to fit into molds so that we can better understand them. And so you can find a number of structures. I've put one in the notes for you if you like having a structure to go along with it. Fox, who is often my primary when I'm looking at, well, let's do it this way, for Hebrew texts, has his own structure, which is actually mostly broken down by sections of conversation and whether the speaker is male or female, or there's another subgroup of, sometimes scholars will refer to them as friends or the chorus or the girls from Jerusalem or something like that. They also periodically seem to speak in this story. Let's see, did I skip over anything really important? Since I'm going to reference Fox a lot, I'll tell you his hypothesis. So Fox is also a student of Egyptian history, and one of his big arguments is that ancient Egyptian love songs or love poetry bear heavy parallels to the way Song of Songs is structured. And so part of his analysis includes comparing Song of Songs to specific ancient Egyptian love poetry, where he identifies some of the meaning by comparing them to the structures of Israelite poetry and Egyptian poetry. So that's his particular theory. Just making sure I got a note on that. So we do get a lot of language of romantic relationships in here, and it is worth noting for those who see Song of Songs as being a allegory for God's love or Christ's love, that there are some biblical parallels to this. For example, Israel is treated as the whorish wife of God by the prophet Hosea. We also get a reference in Ephesians to the idea that the church is the bride of Christ. And so somewhere we do get other ideas of masculinating God and Christ and feminizing the church or Israel in a relationship allegory in the Bible. So that's not without precedence. keep that in mind, though, that when we have that relationship allegory, the man is always God or Christ, and the other party, Christianity, the church, Judaism, Israel, whatever, is always the feminine in the relationship in that allegory. So as we're reading this, if we're looking for that analogy, it's important to hold to that standard, right? Because there's going to be a male and a female voice in this, and if that's the intended allegory, the characters are likely to be preserved, right? It's not going to be sometimes God is a woman and sometimes God is a man in Song of Songs, because that would really just make it confusing. Okay. All right. So, with that said, we're going to dive in, and verse 1:1, the Song of Songs, which is by Solomon. That's we've already covered that. I would like to ask someone to read. I'm going to skip ahead a little here in my book. Just the verses 2 through 4. And these are in the female voice. We're going to do this short for the first chapter.
I can read it.
Sure.
Oh, that you would kiss me with kisses of your mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out. Therefore the maidens love you. Draw me after you. Let us make haste. The king has brought me into his chambers. We exalt and rejoice in you. We extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you.
Okay. Yep, thank you. Okay, so right away we've got a translation issue. The version that you're reading from, I am betting so that the very first line, oh, that you would kiss me with the kisses of your mouth.
Right.
Okay, so does anybody else have that he would kiss me with the kisses of his mouth?
Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. I
Yeah.
guess that's exactly what you...
Right, so we get, it's one of the things that translators have done with this book was decide to force a number of these into a first and second person narrative between two people, right? The actual writing in the Hebrew goes back and forth really quickly between third person and second person. So in the actual Hebrew, it does say, oh, that he would kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. But then in verse 3, it does say, that's why maidens love you. And you had the oil poured out. Also, the oil of Tarak is your name, right? Well, one of the reasons why that makes a distinction then is we get down to verse 4, and it says, the king has brought me into his chambers, which that is how you read it, but for some reason the translator kept the third person, his chambers there, and didn't change it to your chambers, right? Well, if you change everything to the second person in the conversation between the man and the woman, you're making a decision about when he and him and his refers to the man and when it refers to somebody else. Here, the king could just simply be, and scholars argue that it is, a affectionate title, like a woman calling her boyfriend or husband my prince. Doesn't mean he actually has any kind of authority or royalty, right? It's, one day my prince will come, the old Disney song. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, in the Disney story, it's actually a prince, but the woman in that story is not singing, one day some guy's going to come that I'm going to really be in love with, but only if he's royalty, otherwise I'm just kicking him out because I'm a snob. That's not the Disney song. She's singing, one day somebody I love will come, I'm going to call him my prince because I'm going to see him that way, right? It doesn't matter if he's that, in the end it turns out he's actually a prince. That's just the Disney princess metaphor, right? So, Here the same thing is going on. She is calling this man the king, someone, the person that she loves. Now, the interesting thing is, why do some Bibles do this, where they split off the king has brought me into his chambers? Some of the scholars have developed this whole complicated, dramatic metaphor of this story that goes around what's happening, the language in this book. Problem is, we don't have that story anywhere. It's just made up by scholars who see passages like this and say, the king has brought me in chamber. Oh, something must have happened here. Well, let's come up with a story that explains this. Or there must be a story that explains this and we just don't know it, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than taking the simpler answer, which is just she's referring to her guy as a king.
Mm-hmm. King of the house.
Right, the king of the house, right. Another king of the hill.
Yeah.
Another good example. We use these metaphors, and culturally, many cultures have used these metaphors. Fox points out that in Egyptian love poetry, the reference to a woman's love is frequently my prince or the prince. So this is perfectly normal. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this? Anything seem odd or jump out that you want to ask about first before I do a in-depth analysis of some of this? Okay, so, that he'd kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Why specify the mouth, right? In our culture, a kiss is assumed to be a kiss on the mouth. Of course, that's because we don't greet each other by kissing hands or by kissing cheeks or by doing nose kisses. But we know of cultures that use that. And in fact, a lot of those cultures some of those cultures are from the Middle East. And in fact, one of the arguments for this is the reason why she's emphasizing the kisses of his mouth is because she's talking about romantic, intimate, passionate kisses. And there are cultural references for the idea that even a couple showing their affection in a more public or polite way would have this sort of kissing of the noses, where they rub their noses together and sniff each other, something like that. Particularly in this part of the world. And so she's being specific. I'm not just talking about the kind of kisses that people do, everywhere. I'm talking about deep, intimate, passionate kisses. That's what she's longing for. If that's not clear enough, that gets emphasized in the next verse. For your caresses are better than wine, right? So this isn't just a peck kind of kiss. It's a kiss that involves a caress. Well, if we were reading this in Hebrew, it'd be even more blatant, because the word for caresses here is actually a word that literally means lovemaking. So now the Fox makes the argument that even though the word literally means lovemaking, she is actually using it to refer to more of a physical caress, a holding, but she's comparing his caresses to lovemaking, right? So this is passionate, intimate, and deep, right? And this experience, these intimate, passionate kisses are so good, they're better than wine, right? So right off the bat here, we've got this passage that if you're reading it in Hebrew, and within the culture that it's written in, you got a bit of a stretch to make this about God and God's relationships with the church or Israel. Now, if we take the whole Bible into context, it doesn't come across as that big of a stretch. As I mentioned, the book of Hosea talks about how Israel is a whore, and a whore is the wife of God. I mean, that language gets really strong and really particular. And so that would not make Song of Songs, if it is about God and God's relationship with Church or Israel, unique, right? Because like I said, Hosea has language that's strong. In Hosea's context, it's negative, but it's not. It would not be unique. But this kind of language might be hard to explain. I don't know. Let me see. We talked about caresses. The word caresses meaning lovemaking. We use the word lovemaking usually to distinguish between sex and lovemaking, right? In our culture, but here, the Hebrew word here doesn't necessarily require the emotion of love to be involved in the physical act. And so there's a couple examples up from elsewhere in Scripture where this same Hebrew word shows up. In Proverbs 7, there is a section of the text that begins, "Then a woman comes towards him decked out like a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stray at home. Do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him. With impudent face, she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have decked my couch with coverings, colored spreads of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of lovemaking, until morning. Let us delight ourselves with lovemaking." So here, this is the same Hebrew word, and it's in the case of Proverbs, this is the author warning his son against the wiles of women. We talked about this when we looked at the book of Proverbs, and in this case, a woman who is acting like a prostitute. We get a similar one in Ezekiel 23:17. "And the Babylonians came to her into her bed," literally here this is couch, "her bed of love, and they defiled her with their lust. And after she defiled herself with them, she turned from them in disgust." Her bed of love, her bed of lovemaking. One of the reasons why I wanted to include this passage is not only does it use that same word that gets translated here as caresses, but both of these passages make reference to a bed or a couch. And one of the things we can overlook when we read Song of Songs is we're going to catch references to couches. And we tend to think of couches as a place where you sit and have conversation or sit around and chat and that sort of thing. And in these cultures, a couch and a bed are largely the same thing. They're a place where you recline. It's a place of reclining. And so it can be for sleep. It can be for physical acts. It can be for sitting and eating or feasting. The different kinds of furniture that we have today, where we often distinguish a room by its furniture, is far less common in the ancient world. A lot of cultures would have one piece of furniture that served many different functions. And so when we hear the word couch or the word bed, we know that we're dealing with a piece of furniture that had many different functions, the primary two of which are feasting or eating and sleeping, or the other kinds of activities you do where you sleep. And so in both of these passages reference this. But also in Proverbs, this one notes that I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. And we're going to get some references to spices. So, for example, here we have the notion of the scent of oils, right? Smells are going to be a big part of the Song of Song as we read through this. And so Proverbs gives us another reference to that. All right, let's see. Okay. Okay. Any other questions on this one, on this section? One of the other interpretations of this, and it draws heavily upon the king has brought me into his chamber, reflects a story in which, I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, a story in which this describes Solomon bringing a woman into his harem. We know that Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, according to, I think it's First Kings. And so we can get that, we can get a similar kind of imagery, although this is a little strange because in here it's the woman who's sort of making the initial suggestion. Oh yeah, also there's a pun going on here we can't catch in English, that the word kiss or kisses in Hebrew is incredibly similar to the word for wine. And so we're going to get a lot of parallels between wine and kissing throughout this, because the words, there's a play on words going on, but we don't have that in English. So anytime you see wine or kisses, just keep in mind that there's this sort of wordplay going on where the distinction between wine and kissing is much more ambiguous and maybe implied. It may be implied that kissing is intoxicating, or that drinking wine is metaphor for passionate kissing. All right, 5 through 8. Now 5, 6, and 7 are are still the girls speaking, and 8 is the boys' response. But this is a clear exchange between the two of them. And note how your verse 5 starts, because the conjunction may be different for each of us.
I'll read that.
Okay.
Dark am I, yet lovely, daughters of Jerusalem, dark like the tints of Kedar, like the tint curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me because I am dark, because I am darkened by the sun. My mother's sons were angry with me and made me take care of the vineyards. My own vineyard I had to neglect. Tell me, you whom I love, where you graze your flock and where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman, because the flocks of our friends? If you do not know, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your young goats, but by the tents of the shepherds.
Okay, so for this passage, so first off, verse 5. Depending on which translation you're reading, you might read, I am black but beautiful, I am black yet beautiful, I am black and beautiful.
I've got comely.
Or comely, yeah, beautiful, lovely, comely, similar words. So here, there's a lot of discussion of this passage, because if you translate it, I'm black but beautiful, that implies that black is ugly or unattractive, right? And this is one of the reasons why this passage stirs up a lot. It's important to take this passage into its context and understand what's going on here. And the context is in the second half of verse 6. My mother's sons were mean to me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards. My vineyard I could not keep. I like neglected. I think that was a good choice by whoever put that word there. So she may literally be talking about having to care for her family's vineyard. My mother's sons, right? So your mother's sons are either your brother or your stepbrother. So this could be a evil step sibling story, but it doesn't need to be. It could just be a reference to her brothers. But this is the key. they made her work the vineyard, right? She had to be out in the sun, working in the sun. She has acquired a significant tan because she has worked outdoors for a long time. Now, she's not black as in someone who is from Africa. We know that she's not African in origin because later on she'll be referred to as a Shulamite. Now, Shulamite suggests that she's from a place called Shulam. However, there's no such place that we know of, ever. There's no records of it or anything. A couple of arguments are made. Either it's Shunam, which in Hebrew it's possible to switch out the L and the N because they're kind of similar. I don't know of any cases where that's happened, but it's possible. In which case, Shunam is a town that is in northern Israel that is in the territory of the tribe of Issachar. So if you think of the Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Tiberias that's at the top, and then you got the Jordan River that feeds down into the Dead Sea. The area of Issachar, for the tribe of Issachar, is just to the west of the Lake of Jordan, or the River Jordan, just barely south of the Sea of Galilee. So, and it's a small tribal territory. So it's possible they're referring to a town in that area. The other possibility, and I find this one a little more compelling because most of biblical Hebrew didn't have any vowels to it or had very few vowels, and so it would be very easy to make this mistake. Is that she's that they're referring to her as a Salamite, or a person of Salam or Salam, which is a word that means peace, but also could be the meaning for Jerusalem. The beginning of Jerusalem, Yaru, it bears a strong resemblance to the Hebrew word for city. And Salam means peace, wholeness, completeness, right? So it's possible that the early name that eventually comes down to us as Jerusalem was literally city of peace. And so it might be a reference to her being from Jerusalem. That's one possible interpretation. Those are sort of the two prevailing ideas about where she's from, but either way, she's Israelite, so she's going to have the skin tone of the Israelites by nature. So she's not actually saying she's black in the way that we think of black. But what this plays into is sort of the idea of our conception of beauty. It's one that's really fascinating. If you look throughout human history about what are the stereotypical marks of beauty, one of the things that you tend to find, the one consistency throughout all of human history, as far as we know, is that our perception of beauty in almost every culture, in almost every age, is rooted in who has money. Which sounds horrible, sounds kind of greedy. So here's some examples. So in most of the ancient world, and you can find this in a lot of older European art, beautiful women are painted as having a bit of a stomach on them, and having thighs, and being very pale skinned, right? In much of European culture, when we had royalty, even men who are perceived as being important, special, exceptional, high caliber, are painted as a little bit portly, and being pale of skin and having pale hair. Paleness becomes associated with good fortune, with beauty, but so does a little bit of obesity. Why?
You eat good.
Because you eat well. So the beautiful people are the rich ones, and they eat well, so they're a little heavy set. They don't have to work in the sun, so they have pale skin. Look at our modern notion of beauty. Beauty is somebody who doesn't eat heavily, eats a particularly healthy diet and stays skinny, has time to go to the gym and work out, has time to do their hair and their makeup. Our conception of beauty has a lot to do with who is in a position where they don't have to toil a lot, where they don't have to work excessively in order to get by. Now, again, that sounds kind of greedy. That's a negative way to interpret it. If evolution is really a thing, there might be an argument to be made for an evolutionary throwback or even modernary notion of evolutionary trait of seeking the survival of our lineage, right? And if you find a mate who is well off financially, your children are likely to be better off. Therefore, we're attracted in every generation and in every culture to the characteristics that are associated with wealth. Now I'm going to challenge the internet now. Find me the evolutionary biologist who's going to do the paper on it, because I want to read it. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying it's a pattern that we see throughout human history. And so here, when she is saying, I'm black but beautiful, which in Hebrew it could be butter, and the literal translation is ambiguous. She is most certainly saying, I'm black but beautiful, not and beautiful. She is acknowledging that this is a culture that you get darker skinned by working outside. And of course, if you're going to be well off and wealthy and you don't have to go work outside all the time, you're going to be lighter skinned. Whether that's right or wrong, that's the argument she's making. She is complaining, or she is maybe apologizing. She's lamenting that she is dark skinned, and the cause of it is that she has worked outside all of her life. Which brings us to this vineyard comment. Now, most likely, this is probably a reference to a real vineyard. Like, she literally worked on the vineyards, right? But then she says, my vineyard, your translation said, I have neglected, or I could not keep. This is interesting because most likely we have good reason to believe both of these characters, the male and the female, are pretty young in the story. It's not likely, even if she's not young, that she owns her own personal vineyard, right? So what we probably have here is a metaphor for something. My vineyard I've neglected. Now, you can take that really far in a metaphor and be very anatomical and very particular about what she means by saying my vineyard. That's probably not what she means. My vineyard probably refers to the totality of herself as a woman, right? She's saying that because I've had to go work, because I've had to do a job that is usually done by laborers, mostly men, I haven't been able to attend to who I am as a woman, which means I haven't been out there dating, I haven't been out there, hunting men or whatever. I haven't lived that kind of lifestyle. If we take this metaphor too far and make it anatomical, my vineyard I could not keep, and it would imply that she's being promiscuous, which then would be in contrast with what she's just said. I've been too busy working, right? And this is the classic, it's the working woman's woes. Been so busy working, I haven't had time for a dating life. That's basically what she's saying. My soul's beloved. This is an interesting passage because, again, if you want to take the metaphors too far, the Hebrew word for soul is also the Hebrew word for flesh or body. So you could read this as a very graphic statement. But really, she's just emphasizing this is somebody I really love. Like, the depth of this love is great. My true love might be a modern way of saying this, right? As you read this, you read in your translation something like, where do you graze your flock and where do you rest your flock? The words your flock aren't in there at all. She's saying to him, and where do you graze? And where do you lay down, right? At noon or at midday. This is, again, if this is a letter between, or a conversation between a guy and a girl, this could be some playful metaphors, right? Grazing, and we'll get this pattern throughout Song of Songs. The idea of eating or grazing refers to desires and intentions, and what are you after, sort of speaking. So whatever it is we're talking about, where do you pursue that pleasure? Where do you graze? And then where do you lay down? Is the metaphor is a little bit more obvious there. But what we get in the next line is very cultural, and we can easily walk right over that. She says, "Lest I be like one who wraps herself up." What did yours say? Did it say the same thing?
What, are we in verse 8 now?
Yeah, 7. The second half of 7.
Oh, okay. And where you rest your sheep at midday. Why should I be like a veiled woman beside the flocks of your friends?
Yeah. Okay, so one who wraps herself up, or a veiled woman.
Mine says wanders. One who wanders.
Yeah. Yeah. So which translation do you have? I have to ask.
Different from everybody else. Revised Standard Version.
Okay, the Oxford Annotated. Oh, Revised Standard?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. What was the translation again? Wanders?
Yeah, for why should I be like one who wanders?
Okay, so the difference between one who wraps herself up or one who wanders.
Oh, and then it goes beside the flocks of your companions. So I guess
that
is going after the companions.
Yeah, well, so interestingly enough, when we translate this into English, they both can mean the same thing, especially if you know the cultural context. But the Hebrew is literally one who wraps herself up, and we get to this one who wanders or wanders off through what they call an emendation. Some of the scholars have said, oh, this veiling or wrapping oneself up, that doesn't make sense here, but if we change this one letter, or if we change this one mark in the Hebrew, it would mean this. In which case, it's possible the scribes made an error over the years, and it really means one who wanders, right? One who goes off on their own.
Well, I don't know. Is it wandering on? Because the next line, one who wanders beside the flocks of your companions. So, is she chasing his companions?
Well, she's saying, I don't want to be this, right? Whether it's one who wanders or one who veils herself. And the reason, so if it's just one who wanders, then she's going after his companions instead of him, right?
Yeah.
But the cultural context here, and we get an example of this story from Genesis. In Genesis, there's a story of Judah and Tamar. And the bigger story is Tamar marries one of Judah's sons, and before she bears a son for him, he dies. And then they call it the Levirate tradition in the Hebrew Bible. If a woman marries a man and doesn't bear a son before he dies, then she's supposed to marry his brother, and the first male child from that union is considered to be the son of the other brother who died, and the inheritance goes to them. So it's a whole complicated inheritance rule thing. But so what happens is, basically, Tamar marries a succession of Judah's sons, and they all die, and she never bears a son. She feels obligated under God's law, or the scriptural law, to then produce a son for her first husband. And so she seeks out the next available male heir to do this, which, once all the sons are gone, is the father. And so the father kind of dodges his way out of it, and Judah is like, I'm not doing this. So to resolve the problem, Tamar gets crafty. She goes to the flocks, to the fields where Judah shepherds his flock. And she dresses up like a prostitute by putting on a veil so that he doesn't know who she is. And then she goes and seduces him in the field, and she bears a son for her first husband, right? Because this is a culture in which, at the time period, during the time period we're describing, prostitution is more or less a legitimate business, right? It's not criminal in the way we typically see it. So, anyways, the idea that one who is veiled and goes among the shepherds and the flocks it implies a prostitute. And she's saying, I don't want a life like that, where I'm out there wearing my veil, wrapping myself up among the other shepherds, right? So ironically, wanders kind of implies the same thing, but it takes away sort of the cultural context that we get. But she's saying, I don't want to be that kind of person. And she starts us out by saying, tell me, my true love, where do you graze? Where do you rest? Because I don't want to be like a prostitute who goes around with the events. Now, that's important because his response is actually, he's going to, her little playful, where do you graze? Where do you lay down? He's going to answer her in a similar playful tone, right? Mm-hmm. He says, if you don't know. He's not talking literally. He's saying, well, you don't know, right? He's implying she should already know. You should be aware of where this is. Oh, most beautiful of women. But if you don't, if you're being willfully ignorant of those things, then go follow the tracks of the sheep and graze your kids. Well, she's not a shepherdess. She just told you she worked the vineyard. Mm-hmm. So there's something going on here. That's graze your kids by the shepherds' camps. Okay. Again, we have what might be, and this one's kind of debated. It's a little more ambiguous. Might have a reference to the Tamar story, because in the end, Judah pays Tamar with a child, with a newborn goat, a kid, for her services in that story. So that might be a reference, but probably not. Here, just grazing your kids kind of means, putting yourself out there. He's saying, look, if you don't know where I am, if you're going to be willfully ignorant about where I graze, in other words, what are my desires or my interests, and where you can come and find me lying down, well, then just go ahead and go to my companion's flocks, right? Right? He's being playful. He's teasing her back. All right. Thoughts, questions before we move on from there? How are we doing for time? Oof, we're getting tricky. I want to try to finish chapter 1 if we can. Would you like to read 9 through 17?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the last section. Okay.
I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Your cheeks are comely with ornaments, your neck with strings of jewels. We will make you ornaments of gold, studded with silver. While the king was on his couch, my nard gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a bag of myrrh that lies between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyard of Engedi. Ah, you are beautiful, my love. Ah, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves. Ah, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly lovely. Our couch is green. The beams of our house are cedar. Our rafters are pine.
Okay, thank you. Those first 3 verses are from the boy, and verse 15 as well. The rest are the girl speaking. The girl gets the majority of the parts in this poem. And so, we get this reference. He starts out his response to her after he's teased her, suggesting maybe she should go after other men. he turns around and says, and by the way, you're like a horse. So we get a lot of these references in Hebrew, in the Hebrew biblical texts, that don't play well in English, right? There's some other places where people are said they're like cows, women are like cows. Here she's like a horse. Yeah, don't go calling women cows and horses. Not in our culture. Here, however, a mare in Pharaoh's chariotry. Egyptian horses at this time are renowned as being some of the best horses available.
You say that might be good.
Yeah, and in particular, not just Egyptian horses, but Pharaoh's
The best.
own horses. So this is not just a horse from Egypt; it's a horse from Pharaoh's stables,
They're the
and
best.
not just a horse from Pharaoh's stables, but one that drives his personal chariot, right?
They're the best.
So this is the best of the best of the best. So, and of course, if a king or a pharaoh is going around in a chariot, not only is this chariot adorned with golden ornaments and silver ornaments and things like that make it look beautiful, so are the horses too, right? And so he's sort of acknowledging, like, hey, when you are dressed up, when you've got your jewelry on, it reminds me of these amazing horses who are just stunningly beautiful for horses and amazing examples of horses, right? And he even goes so far as to say, we should make for you even more of this, more gold and silver bangles and spangles and whatnot. So, implying we should lavish you with jewelry. Which now here's a good example where we look at the other interpretations and metaphors, because so this is the boy speaking to the girl. So if we take this as God speaking to the church, God is saying that the church is like the best of the best of the best when it's adorned with lots of gold and jewels, lots of gold and jewelry. And so churches that are plain and simple are not God's desire. Wait, what? It's a little problematic. But then to go on and say, once God sees a church that's just decked out in gold, I mean, they spent all the money on themselves, God's response is, I should give you more gold. That's a I mean, I don't care who you are, that's a bit of a problematic interpretation, right?
But you see, go to ancient churches and they are all gold.
There is, right, and there's been a tradition of we should show God's glory by spending a lot of money on our churches. That's
So is that why they do it?
I don't know that anyone actually draws upon this passage to make that argument, but that argument is made sort of post-Constantine. Once Christianity becomes the religion of the land, the rules kind of change. It's hard to read the language of Scripture or the language of Jesus or the language of the prophets and make that argument. You get the one exception of where the nard is poured out on Jesus or rubbed on Jesus' feet, and some of the disciples are complaining, like, think of how many poor people we could feed with it. And Jesus defends the woman but let's be clear, that's specifically because he's about to die, right? And that's why it's okay in that moment. Which would suggest that if that's our story, that we can justify spending a lot of money on the church, then we have to be in the position where the church is about to die, and we're justifying that by saying this is where we're doing this as a memorial, right? We're doing this as an act of love for what is going to be lost. Building a brand new church that's ridiculously expensive, a lot harder to argue from a biblical perspective, right? Okay, so that's the first passage. The king is on his couch again. King could just be a title for this person. Couch again is that same word that keeps coming up about could be a reference for feasting or romantic interludes. She is describing this passage is kind of interesting. So she goes, here we get all of those spices and scents and aromas that we talked about earlier. Origen, who's one of the early church fathers, notes that this first one, the nard, the spikenard, is in particular is a fragrance that only is released when the plant is either squeezed or rubbed. So it implies there's a certain level of physical engagement that's triggering this aroma. But she's talking about being intimate, so intimately close that she can smell him, right? In fact, she even goes on to say, between my breasts he'll spend the night. This phrase, spend the night, is one that never means less than the whole night, right? It comes up in a couple other passages in the Bible, and it always refers to an entire evening in Hebrew. And then she goes on to say, to me, my beloved is a spray of henna. That's another one of the scents. In the vineyards of Ein-Gedi. And Ein-Gedi is an actual place in Israel. You can go visit. It's a tourist location now. It's in the middle of the desert, so there's nothing anywhere around it. There's like human structures, but it's just desert everywhere. Except at Ein-Gedi. And at Ein-Gedi, you can climb, there's a path they've carved out, and you can climb up the side of this mountain up to an ancient archaeological dig for a really ancient temple at the top of this high peak of this like rocky outcropping mountain-like thing. And it's a long trek, and it's, I almost fell off. And by falling off, I mean like 1,000 feet down. When I was there, it's crazy, and they don't have the best of guardrails there. Anyway, so it's thousands of feet up to the top, but what attracts most people is that in this ravine that's carved out of the rock, there's a natural waterfall that flows from a spring, and it creates this beautiful sort of a water oasis at the bottom. And it's lush. The earth is lush with plants and gardens. And so her use of Ein-Gedi has this very vivid description, this vivid imagery of a valley that is lush and rich with a waterfall. And she uses this right after saying, and he'll spend the night between my breasts, right? Literally a valley, right? There's the ravine of Ein-Gedi is the metaphor for this, and if you've been there, you can kind of get what the play on words that's going on with this descriptive analysis. So here's another one of those examples of where we try to draw on, or where some interpretations try to take this to have a religious connotation. So, for example, we have the language of my breasts. So one of the interpretations that you can find on this is, well, breasts refer to the two great things in our religion, the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So it's just a pair of things. Problem is that all of a sudden this metaphor for Ein-Gedi just completely breaks down. Like, then what's this reference to Ein-Gedi about? It just really doesn't make sense there. Another one we get is, well, saying that this is about the Old and New Testament, which also seems really strange because we're saying that God would then be nestled between the Old and New Testament, which maybe you can tap dance your way out of that one, but that sounds a little weird. But the other argument is, well, where are breasts? Well, they're here, right? And if you're going to be nestled in the breast, you're at the person's heart. So this is really a reference to Christ being at the heart of the church, or God being at the heart of Israel. Which, at least you don't have to tap dance your way out of that one to explain why that makes sense. But again, you have the problem of you lose the reference to Engedi. Like, so then what does Engedi mean? And I guess there's richness in the heart, something like that. But that argument, that interpretation is out there. So he goes on to say, "You're beautiful, so very beautiful. Your eyes are like doves. Well, doves are gentle and soft. That's probably the metaphor there. We also have really big eyes, and for some reason, cultures have always, even cultures where you genetically have smaller eyes, often elevate the notion of large eyes. So I don't know what that is. But then, and you've probably heard last time we had Song of Songs here, I mentioned this. I brought up this passage as well. The end of this, where it goes back to her voice, and she says in response, "Well, you're beautiful too, right?" And then she says, "Indeed, our bed is verdant, green, fresh, and our rafters are the rafters of our house are cedars, and the beams are cypresses or pines or whatever." It's hard to know where exactly she's going with this. Her last passage began by referencing a couch and ended with talking about Engedi, this natural resource, this beautifully natural place. And we can be drawn to see maybe that there are some parallels to this. The scholarship doesn't really delve too deep, but if the couch, the bed that she's referencing, is verdant or green, and the ceiling is made up of trees, and we're thinking about a place like Engedi, we're talking about a natural bed of earth, of plant life, and trees overhead. She is describing a romantic encounter in the wilderness, in a green, lush place like Engedi. Which, and if we go back through the rest of the first chapter, we get a similar parallel in that they're talking about meeting in the midday out in the fields, right? Wherever he grazes and lies down, right? This is to put a modern term on it, it's they're having a nooner at the workplace. They're describing this romantic encounter. So that's chapter 1. I've focused on the love poetry aspect of it. I did try to bring in a few examples. I wanted to read because I find these interesting. I have a couple of Bibles, like study Bibles here, and I always find the commentaries kind of interesting. So ours, the Lutheran Study Bible, says that Song of Solomon is about the beauty and power of human physical love. It affirms the goodness of creation, human bodies, and sexuality. Song of Solomon also acknowledges that relationships are a struggle and hard work. They cannot be built on mutual attraction, only on mutual attraction, but must include conversation, commitment, faithfulness, and respect. The book claims that love is as strong as death, which we'll get to later, and precious beyond all wealth. Right? So, that's nice and sweet. Let's see, this one is HarperCollins, which takes so the Lutheran Study Bible is definitely taking a particular religious angle on this. HarperCollins is not anti-religion in any way, but it's a little bit more scholastic and academic, and it's not the most academic of the possibilities. The most academic ones tend to go for the strict love letter, sexual metaphor. This one kind of tries to walk a breadth between them. I think this is the passage I wanted. Okay, the other approaches, and he references interpretations drawing on parallels in Mesopotamian marriage liturgies and stuff like that. But the other approaches do not necessarily deny that the song depicts erotic premarital love. I don't know where that premarital notion comes from. It's there's nothing in the text that actually suggests that they are or are not married, or that their encounter does not involve something of that nature. But anyways, apparently some people have interpreted this to be specifically premarital. It doesn't say one way or the other. But they regard this level of meaning as superficial or incomplete. There are, however, no signs that the author intended to depict any sort of experience other than human sexual love. Nevertheless, one may draw meanings from a book beyond the author's intentions, and traditional interpreters, Jewish and Christian, did so with rich results. I found that quite an interesting read of, we don't have to take this the way it was written. Again, like I said, so this is a slightly more scholastic than a strictly religious text interpretation. So we get three different varieties. There is the ones where I've referenced, like the breast being the Old and New Testament, or being a reference to having the Christ at the heart of the church, for example. Those tend to be a kind of interpretation that I don't have in my library to draw on for quick reference. That tends to be more of the sort of extremely religious point of view that tries to make sure that everything in the Bible, when we interpret it, is in accordance with the teachings of the church or the teachings of the religion. In which case, that's often it often comes from those who take the Bible as literally the Word of God, where every word has to be justified and approved and truthful and accurate, and there's no room for any kind of ambiguity. There might not even be room for allegory or metaphor unless it specifically says that it is. So a lot of those interpretations come from what we would normally call a less academic approach to reading Scripture. But it is out there, and I want to acknowledge that there are different interpretations for this. And now we're way over on time. Any final thoughts or questions before we close? I'm going to close this video real quick. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.